Let's now hear from our first researcher, Professor Mark Tarrant. So Mark is Associate Professor of Psychology Applied to Health at the University of Exeter Medical School. And tonight he'll be telling us about the links between social connections and mental health. Please welcome Mark.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and of course to the organisers of this fantastic event to come and speak today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I recently asked one of my student groups to tell me in a few words how they would describe themselves. This is the answers that they gave me, and I think there's a few things that we could probably pull out of this really simple exercise. First thing that I would note is that, like many of us, students describe themselves in many different ways. The other thing that I would pull out from this is that actually the way that students, and again many of us, describe ourselves is in relation to social categories, social category memberships or social group memberships. And a wealth of research now in my area of psychology has established the importance of group membership and seeing oneself in terms of a group membership for how we make sense of ourselves and how we make sense of the world around us. But a growing body of research also shows us that those group memberships and the connections that we form to people in group settings is fundamentally important to our health. And that's what my talk and my research with the support of the Stroke Association has been about. And it's not all about me, of course. I have a strong sense of identity as a stroke researcher, as do other people in our team across Exeter and elsewhere. So we are a varied bunch of academics, also clinicians involved in the work that we do, and also, of course, patients. And Jane Adamson here, who has been working with us on our projects for a number of years now. It's been absolutely fantastic to have her involvement in it. If I ask this question of people, or my students, or us, what impacts our health, or what are the main things that determine mortality, most people tend to reference these things around the outside, physical or behavioural characteristics, stuff that we do. But some really fascinating research a few years ago now by Holt Lunstead and colleagues turned that assumption very much on its head. And what their research did was to pool lots of previous studies on this topic, what impacts mortality. What they demonstrated is that the number one thing that impacts mortality is not the physical or behavioural things. Actually, it's about social relationships, and it's about connections. That's the number one predictor of mortality across something like 300,000 people. Of course, if you discuss that with somebody who's experienced a stroke, that is absolutely not a surprise to them. So we know, and stroke survivors don't regularly talk about their stroke as being a life-shattering event, not just in terms of its impact on physical health, but also its impact on broadly psychosocial health, or mental, including mental health. And these psychosocial variables or issues have a clear impact on people's relationships, both in terms of people's ability to maintain previous connections that they formed, previous groups that they may have belonged to, be those work groups or any other groups, but also impacts on their ability to grow new group memberships as well, to make new lasting connections. And the importance of being able to do that has been highlighted in research directly with stroke survivors as well. And so this work by Professor Kath Haslam and colleagues at the University of Queensland in Australia demonstrated that being able to reconnect or maintain connections with some of those groups that we previously belonged to is really important in terms of predicting people's satisfaction with life after their stroke. So reconnecting stroke survivors then is an absolute priority for research. And of course, stroke survivors tell us that as well. And my research, our research, and the two projects that I'm going to talk about now is very much about that issue of social connection. The impetus for much of our work has come from stroke survivors. We started talking, when we embarked on some of this research, we started talking with people who have experienced stroke in order to better understand their needs and their priorities, to understand what they thought research should be addressing. And the clear issue for stroke survivors is about social rehabilitation, addressing those psychosocial challenges that they commonly face. And this was really brought home to me by a stroke survivor who said to me, actually, what I want to be able to do, I've come to terms with the physical challenges of my condition, but actually what I want to be able to do is to go down to the corner shop on my own and buy a loaf of bread. I want to be able to do that independently. And that's about socialization and reconnecting with society. So our research has all been about understanding that issue and also understanding what we might be able to do about that from an intervention perspective. So there's two projects that we have completed now, both supported with funding from the Stroke Association. I'm just going to highlight some of the key issues from these two studies. So the first project then is one that we refer to as the Cogs Project, Community Groups for Post-Stroke Support. And this project was looking at stroke survivors' experiences of two key psychosocial health outcomes, loneliness and well-being. But we were also interested in how stroke survivors' membership of a stroke support group across the country, of which there are almost in the region of 400 now nationally, we're interested in how their experiences of those groups might contribute to these health outcomes, how it might help them. So we did this work, started this work before the pandemic, but we've also conducted some work during the pandemic to understand perhaps how those experiences and those group experiences may have changed, potentially as a consequence of the pandemic. So just very quickly, this is the findings from the pre-pandemic work that we did. As I think we all know, loneliness is a major problem for many stroke survivors, much higher prevalence of loneliness in the stroke population than in the population of people that haven't had a stroke. And that was very much replicated here. But what we found is that people's experience of loneliness actually was shaped in part by their membership of a stroke support group. What was particularly important was whether they felt a sense of connection to other people in that group. If they didn't feel connected to that group, then that was clearly associated with higher levels of loneliness. But if they did feel a sense of social connection, if they identified with their peer support group, then that was associated both with lower levels of loneliness and better health or greater well-being as we measured it. So the message then clearly coming out of this first part of this study was that groups matter. Stroke support groups matter for stroke survivors. So we ran this study again about 3 months or so into the pandemic. I think we were all expecting actually to see a downturn in people's psychosocial health. We expected loneliness to be worse and well-being to be worse. But that wasn't the case. It was actually pretty much the same as it was prior to the pandemic. So this is an indication of some resilience, if you like. What we also found, also indicating resilience, is that when we asked them about their experiences of their peer support group and their connections to those groups, their experiences, their perceived connection to the group was about the same as it was beforehand. The really interesting thing about that, I think, is that this was despite the lockdown that we were in. The groups stopped. They couldn't meet in person anymore, but nonetheless, people that we spoke to in this work maintained that sense of psychological connection to those people. And they also, as we saw, shifted their behaviour to allow them to maintain contact, meaningful contact in other ways. And it's probably a bit small, but they did what everybody else did They moved away, of course, from in-person, but to more telephone calls, perhaps some more video conferencing, opportunities to maintain those connections. And that was so important, wasn't it, to everybody to maintain and look for ways to maintain those connections in really quite challenging circumstances for everybody. So groups matter, and they matter even in the absence of being able to connect in person. We followed some of this work up with interviews with a group of stroke survivors just to explore in a little bit more depth what was the experience really like for them as a group member. And they very much talked about how those groups were fundamentally important to their rehabilitation, their psychosocial rehabilitation. So they talked about the importance of being able to connect to people, coming to realize that you're not on your own, even though you might have slightly different experiences, slightly different symptoms, actually there's a lot in common. And that was described as very reassuring by the people that we spoke to. But they also talked about the groups as being an important basis for them to start rebuilding their lives in terms of it being, the groups being a motivating factor, but also a basis for them to develop self-efficacy and confidence to make changes, to try out new things, to go back to some of the things that they were doing previously, to run that 10K, for example. So groups matter, and they matter because they provide the basis for people to rebuild their lives. They provide a tangible resource or access to tangible resources that are important for people to address the psychosocial challenges that they have. So that was the Cogs study. Let me just move on then, just the last few minutes, just to talk about the second program of work. And this is a program of work which tested an intervention, a new intervention that we developed, which was aimed at people who have aphasia after stroke, which we know is a somewhat neglected population when it comes to research. The impetus for this project, like our other work, has very much been from stroke survivors themselves. We were approached about 10 years ago now when we started this project. We were approached by a person with aphasia who asked this seemingly straightforward question: does group singing help people with aphasia? The answer is probably not as straightforward as we hoped it might be. There were no answers when we embarked on this journey. So we put together our team and we developed and designed a new intervention with important input from stakeholders, including speech and language therapists, patients, and also academics like myself. And we developed what we call the Singing for People with Aphasia group intervention. It's a 10-week intervention, principally focused on supporting people to connect, with the objective being that this will help them to develop the confidence that they need in order to continue to rebuild their lives after a stroke. It's a two-phase project. The first phase involved a pilot trial, an embedded process evaluation. Second phase we haven't started yet. We're seeking funding for that currently, and that's to conduct a definitive trial to answer that question conclusively: does this work? What I'm just going to share with you for a minute or two that I've got left is some of the really, I think, interesting work about the processes that is going on here when we ran these groups. It's very much about the mechanism by which these groups might be functioning. So we ran the program, the group singing program, in 3 different groups in the southwest of the UK, and we video recorded every group session. There's a lot of video material. Thankfully, we have access to some fabulous students who are enthusiastic also about stroke research, and we trained some of them to code the videos. We chopped the videos into segments and we randomized them to make it hard for them to predict what we thought might happen. And we asked them to code the videos. We trained them to code the videos in terms of the degree of exhibited connectedness shown by the group as a whole. And what we found, as you can see here on this figure, was a steady but clear increase in exhibited connectedness, what we term shared social identity across the 10-week session. This was really important finding for us to be able to document that this intervention is doing what we wanted it to do. The fundamental goal for this intervention was to connect people, to have people to come to the group and over time develop that sense of connection for all the reasons that the Cogs study was articulating. So we're now ready to move this to provide a definitive test of the impact of this intervention on psychosocial health. So just to very quickly wrap up now, these two programs of work I hope have demonstrated for you the importance of groups in stroke recovery, particularly for psychosocial health. It comes with a bit of a warning, and that is about there's a need for us to better understand how do we make this happen in practice, because we've probably all been in a group from time to time where we think this group is not for me. Yeah? Or you're in a group which starts off for you and then it goes in a different direction. So it's a bit of a balancing act. So questions for us is about what do we have to do to keep the group in good balance? And there are aspects there about organisational things, but there are also aspects of facilitation. What do the people that run the groups need to do in order to reliably connect people? So that's the focus of our ongoing research. So just lastly then, stroke groups are important to stroke survivors. They're an important basis for stroke survivors to reconnect with society. It's also a safe environment for them. They very much talk about that as an opportunity, groups as an opportunity to help get your life back on track. So if we do it well, if we can learn and understand how to do it reliably, I think the main message here is that social connectedness through groups can be a powerful resource to support people in their rehabilitation after stroke. Thank you very much.